Let's say you went to get help. You tell someone what's happening in your life, and somewhere in that process, the way that you're telling it starts to become the problem. You're too emotional, you're too intense, you're too needy, and now there's a word for it. A word that goes into a file, and once it's in your file, it changes how everyone in that system reads everything you say and do. Your distress gets called manipulation. Your needs gets called dependence. Your protests get called symptoms. Today's episode is about a diagnosis called borderline personality disorder, about where it came from, what it does, and what a growing body of research says it actually is. This episode is a little bit different. We're not looking necessarily at neuroscience today. We're looking at the critical analysis of how psychiatric language itself operates as a system of power. And I think it's equally as important to cover in the show. Welcome to Brick by Brick, where we explore mental health research one paper at a time. I'm your host, Nafisa Golwala. I'm not a clinician. I'm someone who believes that good research deserves a wider audience and that most people, given clear and honest information, are capable of doing something meaningful with it. Today's paper is Cobert et al., Dismantling the Diagnostic Construct of Borderline Personality Disorder, a critical discourse analysis, published in the International Journal of Mental Health, Nursing in 2026. Before we get into the argument, I want to be clear about what kind of paper this is, because it's different from what we usually cover. This is not a randomized controlled trial, it's not a brain imaging study, it's a critical discourse analysis, which means the researchers are examining psychiatric language itself as an object of study. They're treating the words clinicians use, the categories in the DSM, the way BPD literature is written, as evidence. That's a legitimate methodology in academic research, but it's a different kind of evidence than neuroscience. So keep that in mind as we go through. So, borderline personality disorder. What is it supposed to be? BPD is a psychiatric diagnosis characterized by intense emotional experiences, fear of abandonment, unstable relationships, impulsivity, self-harm, and suicidality. It is also one of the most contested diagnoses in psychiatry. The diagnostic criteria have been criticized for decades for being vague, overlapping almost entirely with complex trauma presentations, and for lacking the scientific validity that most diagnostic categories claim. Around 75% of people diagnosed with BPD are women. That number alone is worth sitting with because it's not explained by prevalence differences in the underlying experiences the diagnosis is supposed to describe. The diagnosis is widely used to justify specific approaches to care, including what the literature calls treatment pauses, which are gaps in therapeutic contact framed as preventing dependence. People diagnosed with BPD are among the most frequently excluded from the crisis service in mental health care. Clinicians regularly describe people with this label as manipulative, untreatable, or unworthy of care. Exclusion from crisis care for people who are suicidal is not a therapeutic intervention. It's a decision about who is considered deserving of help. And the fact that it gets framed as a clinical protocol is exactly why this paper is so intriguing. Okay, so let's talk about the history, because how a diagnosis gets made matters. BPD was formally introduced into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1980, in the third edition, so the DSM-3. The task force that created it was led almost entirely by male psychiatrists. Two women, Edicott and Robbins, are documented as having notable technical input, and even their contributions were historically sidelined, which really isn't surprising. Here's what's particularly significant. When BPD was codified in 1980, sexual victimization was not recognized in psychiatric nosology as a causal contributor to post-traumatic responses, meaning the task force building a diagnosis that would be applied overwhelmingly to women with histories of sexual abuse explicitly excluded sexual abuse from the framework explaining their experiences. Trauma responses got characterized as character pathology instead. The paper puts it plainly, BPD attributes symptoms solely to characterological dysfunction without recognizing their adaptive nature in the face of childhood trauma. What that means is the way the diagnosis is built, how someone responds to being hurt becomes evidence of who they fundamentally are, rather than evidence of what was done to them. That's not a small design flaw, that's a foundational one. The researchers draw a line from historical construct of hysteria, which similarly pathologized women's emotional expression and need, to the BPD framework. The language is just different. The structure is the same. Women's survival responses to violence get recorded as personality pathology. Their need for safety and connection gets reframed as dysfunction and dependence. And the paper argues that this is not an accident of history that's being corrected. It's a logic that's still embedded in how the diagnosis operates right now. One of the central critiques in this paper is what the researchers call the dependence framework. BPD literature frequently warns that long-term therapeutic relationships risk fostering dependence, and that supporting someone consistently might undermine their autonomy and self-management. So the solution is to withdraw care, limit contact, and set firm boundaries across access to support. Feminist theories have been pointing out the problem with this for decades. Dependence is not treated as a shared human condition in these frameworks. It's feminized and devalued. Independence is equated with moral worth, and emotional need gets reinterpreted as weakness, instability, or manipulative behavior, rather than as legitimate relational communication. The researchers make a specific and important point about what conditional care actually looks like. When access to support is contingent on compliance, when help is withheld as a form of behavioral control, this can structurally mirror the dynamics of childhood abuse that many of these patients have already experienced. The care system ends up replicating the very harm it's claiming to treat. And the paper that's documenting the harm, meaning harm caused by the treatment itself rather than the condition, is well evidenced and largely unaddressed in BPD literature. One clinician quoted in the paper saying, "Clinicians learn the art of self-delusion, convincing ourselves we are not letting patients down, but instead doing the clinically appropriate thing. Well-intentioned initiatives become misappropriated to justify neglect." That quote is about a broader pattern in psychiatry, but it's named directly in the context of BPD, and I think it's honest in a way that most clinical literature isn't. Real autonomy, the paper argues, doesn't come from withdrawing support until someone is independent. It comes from consistent, non-punitive care. Even mainstream psychological frameworks, including self-determination theory, recognize that making care contingent on compliance is structurally coercive. The research on this isn't ambiguous. The paper identifies two major categories of experience that BPD framework structurally cannot account for: sensory processing and cultural differences. On sensory processing, BPD literature frames self-harm and suicidality primarily as expressions of emotional dysregulation or unmet attachment needs. But a growing body of empirical research contradicts this as the exclusive explanation. Sensory processing differences, including difficulties with interoception, meaning awareness of one's own bodily states, and exteroception, are emerging as significant predictors of self-harm and suicidality across diagnostic categories. Alexithymia, which describes difficulty identifying and describing emotional states, and is closely linked to interoceptive processing, is repeatedly associated with elevated risk of self-harm. These findings don't point to attachment disruption as the primary driver. They point to a sensory affective dimension of distress, and the psychodynamic framework simply isn't designed to see. This matters particularly for people with autism, who are disproportionately misdiagnosed with BPD, especially those assigned female at birth. People with autism report using self-harm to navigate overwhelming sensory states, to soothe intense sensory input, or to reconnect with bodily sensation when feeling disassociated. When these experiences are disclosed to clinicians, they are frequently reframed through BPD language as attention-seeking, manipulation, or emotional instability. The sensory reality gets overwritten by diagnostic frameworks. That's a very specific kind of harm. Someone tells a clinician what's actually happening, and the clinician's framework doesn't have a category for it, so it gets relabeled into something that fits the existing model. On cultural differences, attachment theory, which is central to how BPD is conceptualized, developed from research conducted with white, middle-class nuclear families in Britain and the United States. It established norms to one-on-one maternal care, verbal expression of distress, and early assertions of individual autonomy as universal markers of secure attachment. They are not universal. They're culturally specific. Many Indigenous, Black, immigrant, and collectivist communities share caregiving across extended kinship networks. They maintain relational embeddedness within extended family structures. They understand care as collective responsibility. When attachment frameworks treat Western caregiving as the default, other caregiving practices get misread as boundary violations or interpersonal instability. Cultural patterns become clinical symptoms at that point. The paper gives specific historical examples. The stolen generations in Australia, the 60s scoop in Canada, attachment theory was directly operationalized in these policies, used to remove Indigenous children from their family on the grounds of alleged attachment deficits. Indigenous kinship systems were pathologized as fragmentation and neglect. The colonial violence was reframed as child welfare. Perhaps the most striking section of this paper is the argument that BPD diagnosis itself is a primary source of harm, not a secondary consequence of poor implementation. The label frequently functions as secondary trauma. It erodes self-worth. It intensifies shame. It increases suicidality. In other words, for many people, the diagnosis becomes a heavier burden than the original stress that brought them to care. And because BPD criteria overlap heavily with trauma presentation, depression, anxiety, and experiences with autism, the diagnostic criteria is elastic enough to be applied to almost any intense emotional expression or relational difference. There's a specific mechanism the paper calls diagnostic recursivity, and I think it's worth understanding clearly. When someone gets diagnosed with BPD, reports harm caused by the diagnosis or the treatment, that report frequently gets reinterpreted through the diagnostic framework itself. Self-advocacy becomes defiance. Defiance becomes further evidence to personality pathology. The complaint about harm confirms the diagnosis. The loop is closed, and there's no way out of it once the framework is recognized. One paper quoted in this research actually illustrates the problem directly by describing online communities of people who are critical of the BPD diagnosis as demonstrating. And I am summarizing here the very psychodynamics that characterize BPD, resistance to the diagnosis as proof of the diagnosis. That's circular reasoning, and the paper names it as such. The paper also documents who gets this label disproportionately. LGBTQ plus people, particularly transgender and gender diverse people, are diagnosed with BPD more frequently than cisgender patients, regardless of whether there are any underlying personality pathology. Research shows that clinicians appear inclined to assign a BPD diagnosis to trans and gender diverse patients in ways that don't correspond to group differences in personality. Gender identity and sexual orientation themselves, rather than empirically demonstrable psychopathology, becomes the basis for the diagnosis. People diagnosed with BPD are 75% more likely to be homosexual or bisexual than comparison groups with other personality disorder diagnoses. The paper locates this in psychiatry's longer history of using personality pathology frameworks to police gender and sexual nonconformity. The DSM-1 explicitly categorized homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. Gender variance was later codified under gender identity disorder. The paper argues the mechanisms hasn't actually changed, just the specific targets. The most widely used treatment for BPD is dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, which has itself shown to cause iatrogenic harm for a specific number of people. While DBT is helpful for some, the fact that it can also be harmful and traumatizing is rarely acknowledged in clinical settings. Many patients describe it as invalidating, dehumanizing, and delivered within a culture that treats the therapy as infallible. When a treatment causes harm and clinicians delivering it are institutionally protected from acknowledging that harm, the people experiencing it have nowhere to go. The paper calls for abolishing BPD as a diagnostic category. That's a strong position, and I think it's important to understand what the argument actually is rather than what people assume it to be. The argument is not distress isn't real. The argument is that the BPD construct is not a clinically valid or ethical defensible framework for understanding that distress, and its continued use causes more harm than it addresses. The paper specifically argues against what it called rebranding. Renaming BPD as complex emotional needs or emotional dysregulation syndrome doesn't dismantle the underlying logic. It updates the language while leaving the governance structure intact. The same people get categorized, the same care gets conditionally withdrawn, the same distress gets moralized. New name, same system. Nothing's changed. What the paper calls for instead is care rooted in relational safety, sensory-informed approaches, cultural responsiveness, and what it calls epistemic humility, which is the willingness of clinicians and institutions to hold their own frameworks as potentially wrong and to center lived experience as legitimate knowledge rather than a symptom. The paper acknowledges that this requires not just individual practice change, but institutional willingness to question diagnostic authority altogether, which is frankly a much harder ask. But the researchers are explicit that without it, any effort to reduce stigma or improve treatment outcomes within the existing BPD framework will remain, in their words, fundamentally misdirected. I think what I find most interesting about this paper is the honesty of the argument. It's not saying the system is trying to do harm, it's saying that a system can produce predictable, documented harm through its structure, regardless of intentions of the people operating within it. And at some point, the documentation of that harm has to matter more than the institutional investment in the existing framework. So, that was a lot of information. Let's put it all together. A diagnosis that emerged from a male-dominated task force that didn't include sexual trauma in its framework. That describes women's survival responses as personality pathology. That frames needs as dependence and dependence as something to correct. And that its own literature documents as causing shame, increased suicidality, and exclusion from care, and that, when you raise those concerns, it converts your protests into further evidence of the diagnosis. This paper is not saying that the distress is not real. It's saying that the framework built to describe and respond to that distress is failing the people it's supposed to serve in ways that are documented, predictable, and structural. And here's what I want to leave you with. If you've ever been in a clinical encounter where your need was treated as a problem to be managed, where your distress was reframed as behavior rather than communication, where asking for help made you less credible rather than more, the research in this paper names what that experience is and where it comes from. It came from a system, not from you. And remember, things can be redesigned. They just have to be built brick by brick. If today's episode helped, share it with someone who needs it. Leave a review if you have a moment, and I'll see you in the next one.